Looked at kind of the background of Jerusalem, what was going on in Jerusalem, in the kingdom of Judah, kind of a history of the battles that were going on and what was surrounding these children as they got carried off into captivity under King Jehoiakim. And tonight we kind of look at the situation that they found themselves in when they got to Babylon. So I was looking at this, and it was almost like these children were being sacrificed. And as part of the deal to make peace for Jerusalem, they gave up treasures out of the house of the Lord. They gave up, we don't know how many children were carried off here. Some estimates that there were thousands carried off. We know that in a later captivity, when Ezekiel was carried off, that there were around 10,000 that were carried off captive. But there were a lot of these children, and they were of the king's family. They were sons of the princes, sons of the nobles of Jerusalem that were carried off. And probably nearly a whole generation was taken out of Jerusalem of the rulers of Jerusalem were carried off, and these were it's kind of an interesting deal. We looked, if you remember last week, the very first verse that we read was out of the book of Isaiah, and Isaiah was prophesying to King Hezekiah and told him that your children, the seed of your loins, they're going to be carried off. And they're going to be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. And that was a prophecy given some 200 years before King Jehoiakim and before Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, Babylon at the time that Isaiah prophesied that wasn't even really anywhere in the picture. Babylon was way over on the other side of the desert, and the problems they were having at that time was with the Assyrian Empire, the nation of Assyria. And so that prophecy now is come true, and we see this. I want to read here in Daniel chapter 1. Let's go ahead and we'll just read it, beginning in, we'll just read the whole chapter. We read the first two verses last week, but we can reread those two verses. It won't hurt us, I don't think. So it says, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. His God is Bel, B-E-L. Okay, and that'll come into play in a minute as we look at this. Into the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, and children in whom was no blemish, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom and cunning and knowledge and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now among these were of the children of Judah Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and of Azariah of Abednego. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort. Then shall you make me endanger my head to the king. Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, and Mishael, and Azariah, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse or porridge to eat, and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat, and as thou seest, deal with thy servants. So he consented to them in this matter, and proved them 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink, and gave them pulse. As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, that's 3 years, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. And Daniel continued even unto the 1st year of King Cyrus. 1st year of King Cyrus. So remember, Cyrus is the king that eventually lets them go back. And you find that in the books of Nehemiah and Ezra. And Cyrus is the king. So the whole captivity period of the nation of Israel, there was a man standing before the very king of Babylon, and later the king of the Persians. And I was looking at this, how that, a lot of times we are in places in our life that are not really of our choosing. And sometimes we're in places because of bad decisions we made. Sometimes we're in position just because of circumstances that are beyond our control. And sometimes we get to places where we think that everything has fallen apart. We have been attacked. I mean, here is these Hebrew children. We don't know how many there were. Of them, they took out this group that they said were without blemish. I put in your notes a few scriptures in Leviticus. And looking at that, when they, basically it's talking about when they would bring a sacrifice, somebody be sacrificed of a ram or a bull or a sheep, that it had to be without blemish, that it had to be the best of the best. And so these kids were kind of being sacrificed. Even after they got to Babylon, they're brought into Babylon, they're put into the house of the eunuchs. We don't know. I don't know that it really matters whether or not they were made eunuchs or not. We do know that was pretty much the custom of the kings when they would bring these kids in. Especially the ones that they were going to give power to, because they didn't want them having a lineage, a house and a lineage. There's no record in Scripture. It doesn't specifically say, and so we're not. It's not that big of an issue, and we know there's nowhere mentioned in the rest of the book of Daniel that he had a wife or a family or anything like that. But especially the king is going to bring a foreigner in and put him into a position of authority in his kingdom. You don't want him having too much authority in that lineage. And so, these kids are brought in and unspeakable things are done to them. They are brainwashed. Their lineage is taken away from them. And these were children that had been taught. They had been brought up in the house of the king in Jerusalem. They were the sons of the rulers and the nobles of that place. They had been brought up in that. They were educated in that. And now all of a sudden everything is turned on its head from one day to the next. And so we don't know how long they were in the house of the eunuchs before the king made this proclamation and told him, pick some of them out, the best of the best, and bring them. But he told the master of the eunuchs, the master of that household, and they would raise these children up, and for the most part, these would be raised up to serve actually in the temple of Bel. Now this is Bel, B-E-L, and not Baal, B-A-A-L, who is the god of the Assyrians. But Bel was a god who's likened to a dragon, is generally the way he is presented. And this was the god of the Babylonians. And these children were brought in, and it was almost humiliating to the nation that they brought. Okay, we're going to take your kids and we're going to make them eunuchs and we're going to put them to serve in the temple of our gods. And we're going to take the treasures and the gold out of your temple and we're going to bring it into the house of our God. And it's going to, these sacred relics that you had and these cups and plates that were used for the sacrifices to Jehovah God are now going to be used in the sacrifices to our God. And these children that you had raised up and taught to serve your God, now they're going to be raised up and taught to serve our God. And it was this whole situation that is brought up, and it's interesting. We don't know how many were initially brought in this captivity. We don't know how many were separated out from among them to be there to serve in the king's palace, but a certain group were separated out, ones without blemish, ones that had that were smart, and they were set up to be given into the king's house. And the prince of the eunuchs here, I can kind of imagine he goes and he counts the ones out that he wants to send, kind of probably his favorites. And then he assigns them. It appears in Scripture here that probably in groups of several, he's assigning them to different masters. Because we look here in verses 9 and 10 where Daniel goes to the prince of them and says, I don't want to eat what's going on. Well, the master of the eunuchs turns him down. He says, no, I'm not going to lose my head over, you not wanting to do what you're told. But then Daniel goes to another man whose name is Melzar, and this is the one who the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, those four. So this prince divides them up into groups. Daniel's already said, look, I don't want to eat the king's meat because the king's meat had been sacrificed to the god Bel. I don't want to drink the king's wine because it had been given to the god Bel. And Daniel had purposed in his heart, it says, not to defile himself. So he had appealed to the prince of the eunuchs, and he had said, no, I'm not going to lose my head over it. But then he goes to the one that he had set over these four. So Daniel had a lot of influence over these other three young men. Daniel, sometimes if one person will stand up, then other people will stand up with him, right? So Daniel had a lot of influence with them. Now, it says here that their names were changed, and I wanted to talk about, we mentioned that last week, how that we always call Daniel, we never call Daniel Belteshazzar. But we very rarely ever call the other three, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. We call them Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's how we know them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And those are their names. And the names are interesting. I've got it there in your notes to look at. But Daniel, his name, all three of these had names that had to do with Jehovah God. Daniel's name was God's judge, or Jehovah's judge. It ends in El, which is Jehovah. That's Elohim. That's the word for God. Bethel is the house of God. And Daniel was God's judge, or the judge of God. And so Jehovah Judges, or God Judges, was Daniel's name. And they changed his name to Belteshazzar, which in the Chaldean language meant a prince of the god Bel. And boy, what a slap in the face is that change. Hananiah, his name meant God's gift or Jehovah's gift, and they changed his name to the king's friend. And Mishael, his name meant none like Jehovah, or who is like Jehovah, is what his name means in Hebrew. And they changed it. It's kind of interesting. His name was called Little Sheep. And I'm thinking that may have been kind of like the pet name that the prince of the eunuchs had for him. It's this little sheep. But his name was Little Sheep. That one, we don't really know why that name was given to him. Azariah meant God's helper, whom Jehovah helps. It was Azariah, and his name was changed to Abednego, which means servant of Nego. And Nego was one of the lesser gods underneath Bel. They believed that he was the god of war, and his emblem was the planet Mars, and it's where later on the Roman god Mars or the Greek god Mars and the Roman god, I can't remember. My mythology is a little rusty. It's been a few years, but there was a Roman name and a Greek name for the gods, and so they didn't just change their names to a Chaldean name. They changed their names to something humiliating for them, and that was to be their name. And they separated out this group, and they were going to give this group special training to be able to serve in the king's house. They were going to have to learn the Chaldean language. They were going to have to learn the wisdom and science. And that wisdom and science is when it talks later about the magicians and the astrologers. In other words, they were going to be trained in the astrology and all of the occult things of the Chaldeans, of the Babylonians, and forced to go through there to forget the training they had received as children. And now they are young, probably preteens. They're being taught this. For 3 years, we're going to undergo all of this training. But Daniel purposed in his heart to stand separate. Now, we were talking in the beginning how we get to a place where it's not really where we wanted to be. Daniel, growing up in Jerusalem, probably did not have in his mind and as his ambition to be carried off, to be made a eunuch, to be forced to change his name, to be all of these things that happened to him. That's probably not the future that he envisioned for himself. It's probably not the future his parents envisioned for him, bringing him up in the royalty there in Jerusalem. But you know what? It's what happened. That is where he ended up. But Daniel had the strength to stand separate. I put in there that it was separation, not isolation. A lot of times, there's a line as we walk in this world of separation, being separate from this world, but not being isolated from the world. In some religions have the monks that separate themselves from the world, but they also isolate themselves from the world, And so in order for them to find that inner peace and communion with God, they've got to totally separate from everything and isolate themselves from the world. But we're not called to isolate ourselves. He says you're in the world, you're just not of the world, right? Is what Jesus said. You're in the world. So Daniel didn't ask to be excused from this group. He just asked, look, I just can't eat this meat. I can't drink this wine. Give us pulse. Pulse is basically real watery, like porridge or cream of wheat or something like that, made with just wheat flour and water. That's all it was. And imagine for 3 years eating nothing but, I kind of like malted milk, but I got to have some brown sugar in it or some syrup in it or something, right? I got to have something in it to give it some flavor, but just flour and water in a bowl. Here's what you're going to eat. Day after day after day for 3 years. But they thrived on it. They learned everything that they were taught. They became wiser in not only their own We know that they didn't forget their God and the teachings they had. They probably were not allowed access to the Jewish scriptures, to the Torah, to the books of Moses and the law. And so they had to rely on what they had been taught as a child. I was thinking about that as I was preparing this. If my children were found in this situation, have I taught them enough? Even as children, that they'll be able to remember it and know it and live it as they grow older. You know, it's hard enough as we get children that grow up the entire time in our house and leave to wonder. We still wonder, did I teach them enough? Did I do enough? Did I do everything that I could do? I mean, we worry so much about a lot of things with our kids.
Donnie
You know, are they going
on
to make
the
the
trying to
baseball
see
team?
she's
Are they going to do
tired.
this? Are they going to do that?
Donnie is just trying to write on her.
We spend a lot of time on things that are temporary. Very few of our children are going to be professional sports players.
Yeah.
You know?
True.
But every one of our children are going to stand before God.
That's right. That's right.
You know? There's just no question. I have 7 kids. I don't know. Sarah may make it some professional sports someday. I don't know. But, you know, they've played, you know, my daughters have played softball and they've played basketball and they've played soccer. There's nothing wrong with, I'm not talking about isolating ourselves from the world.
Yeah.
I'm talking about as I teach my children the most important thing that is gonna get them through hard times is not whether or not, you know, they can slide into second base but it's do they know the Lord.
Amen.
And one thing we know about these 4 kids is that their parents at a young age had instilled enough into them that they were able to stand up. It lasted Daniel for the 70 years that he was in captivity, till he was an old man. Now later when he was rich and important and powerful, maybe he was able to get access to the scriptures on his own. I don't know, probably. I imagine that it was within his power, he did. But he is there. But the provision of God in all of this, the nation is being conquered. They're going to be in captivity for 7 years. And God, in his planning and in his eternal purpose, makes sure that there's somebody that has the king's ear, whichever king it is. And we go through a lot of kings in this time. Nebuchadnezzar goes crazy and his son takes over, and then his son dies, and then the Persian Empire conquers him. And we're going to see as we go through this book that there's the Persian Empire, there's King Darius and King Cyrus and King Belshazzar and King Nebuchadnezzar and Nebuchadnezzar II. I mean, there's all these different kings, but there's somebody that has the ear of the king speaking for his people that are in captivity. There are 3 other young men that were made princes. The Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were placed over portions, and they were able to see that the Jews that had been carried off, that were in their provinces, were taken care of, that were humanely treated. God, even in his anger, even when he was putting out his punishment on them, and his righteous judgment on them, he still made sure that it wasn't more than they could bear.
Amen.
He promised that he was going to bring them back, and he made sure. The ones that were in the river, the ones that were carried off captive to the river Chebar, we know that he gave them Ezekiel as their prophet to be there with them and to teach them and to train them. And the children that were born there in captivity had a man of God there with them to teach them and to raise them up in these things. And so God's hand was over all of this from the very beginning. So Daniel goes to this second one and he asked him to be able to do this. They tried out for 10 days. After 10 days, they looked just fine. They looked better than the other kids. And so he says, all right, it's pulse for 3 years. It's porridge for 3 years. And then we see the results of taking a stand. You know, sometimes it's hard to take, you know, there are things that are kind of expected of Christians, right? We're not gonna be drunks.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna beat my wife. I'm not gonna be, you know, selling drugs out on the street corner. I mean, those are things that are just kind of given, and those are things that are not too terribly hard to not do.
Right.
Right? But sometimes it's harder to take a stand, and even when it's stuff like, I'm not gonna get involved in this gossip that's going on. I'm not going to do something that's gonna hurt my brother. There's things that, you know, that we can purpose in our heart. You know what, Daniel wasn't speaking for all of those other kids. It says Daniel purposed in his own heart. You know what, Tom, I'm not your judge. There is a judge.
Yes.
And you're gonna stand before him one day.
Absolutely, yes.
And it's my job as pastor to help prepare you for that day, right? But, I got enough to worry about with me. But you know what, I can say, when I'm on purpose in my heart, I don't want to defile myself with this.
Yes.
With it. You know, we don't have, I'm not a real super legalistic type of guy. I'm not telling you can't have cable TV and all that kind of stuff in your house. I've had it, and I don't have it at the moment. But I realized once when my kids were real young and we put on this movie, I was thinking about it, and I said, you realize that we are paying people to come into our house and curse at our children?
Amen.
And I was just thinking about that, and I'm not saying it's a sin for you to have, that's for you to say. That's for you to purpose in your heart what's going on. But I just thought, why am I paying $100 a month for people to come in and scream cuss words at my children and parade homosexuals around in front of them? You know, we got that antenna, and we get 3 or 4 channels, and we got Netflix, and I can control what my children watch on Netflix. And we can do some things like that on the TV, and we've got videos that they can put in and watch. But why don't I want to pay somebody to come and parade all that around in front of my children? You know, it's one thing you're watching TV and something comes on, and I can deal with that, but it just got to me, and I said, you know what, that's $100 a month I can put to better use, you know, for me. And other people say, well, I don't know how you live without direct TV. I don't know.
You get used to it. I mean, you know, it's.
We have 4 channels.
Right.
There you go.
I didn't have cable.
No. I mean, I grew up with 2 channels, and I know y'all are probably the same.
Mm-hmm.
We had 2
4,
channels.
5, and 8. And
We had
11, yeah.
one out of Midland and one
We had
out of
4
Odessa.
channels.
That was the 2 channels we had. And then later on, when cable came out, my parents finally got cable, and we had 5 channels.
Big time.
We had one all the way from Dallas, and I got to watch Bugs Bunny, and I was happy. But you know, things change, but we need to be. Sometimes we have to come to a place that, you know, we can find ourselves in these situations, but we need to realize, like Daniel did, that, you know what, I'm where I am because God's put me here.
Yes.
He's allowed, God's not the cause of all the bad things that have happened to me, but you know what, He's an omnipotent God.
Yes.
Everything that's happened, He's allowed to happen. It's just the way it is. And even things that I have done, and mistakes that I have made that have brought me to situations where I am, you know, God allowed that. And it's amazing to me that through all of that God still finds a use for me, and that in everything that's gone on, and everything that's gone on in this church, you know what, God's still got a purpose in all of that.
Yes.
He allowed all of that to happen. You know? And that we can still get and say, okay, you know what? I'm in the palace. I'm a eunuch in the palace of the king. I have no control over, in a spot where he had no control over where you were gonna sleep, no control over where you were gonna live, no control over what you were gonna learn, where you were gonna work, all those things. I mean, no control Daniel had over anything. And he said, but you know, there's one thing I can control. I can control what they force down my throat.
I still have God.
Mm-hmm. I can choose whether or not I'm gonna swallow what they're giving me. I can't control what they give me, but I can control whether or not I swallow. You know, I can't control what life throws at me, but I can control what I let defile me. Right? And so, you see, separation, but not isolation. He was still there. And he learned what they asked him to learn. He learned the language. He did. In fact, he did it, you know, my dad said, you know, whatever you're going to do it to the best of your ability. And I took him literally, because when I did something wrong, I did it as good as I could, right? And to the best, everything as good as you can. And even in that situation, Daniel was able to glorify God as a young child. Now we're about to get into we start chapter 2. Chapters 2 through 7 are real interesting in Daniel. They're written in Aramaic instead of Hebrew. And I'm not sure, it's kind of interesting. Daniel, the book of Daniel is written in 3 languages. Part of it's in Chaldean and part of it's in Hebrew, and chapters 2 through 7 are in Aramaic. And Aramaic was kind of the language up north of Israel, and he may have written it kind of as a code language because he didn't think the Chaldeans could read it, you know. And so we're not exactly sure why, but chapters 2 through 7, the way they're put together, are very interesting, and we'll get into that next time. And that's where the really cool stories that we know about, the dreams of Nebuchadnezzar, the lion's den, and the fiery furnace, so all of that we find in chapters 2 through 7. And so the handwriting on the wall, all that is in chapters 2 through 7. So that's kind of the next section. But I was looking at this idea of God being able to bless right where they were. And, you know, not every time that you're in a bad situation does that mean that you're not being blessed.
Amen.
You know, we tend to think that God's blessings are money and wealth and fame and prosperity, but that's not necessarily it. You know, the famous verse in Jeremiah 29:11 that everybody kind of uses as their you know, where he says, I know the plans that I had for you, plans for good, not for evil. Well, I mean, that's true. But the plans God had for Daniel that were for good and not for evil involved him being ripped out of his home as a young child and carried off captive and held prisoner and humiliated and, you know,